Hi everyone, I'm Izzy and I'm the co-founder here at Kind Community, and I'll be your host today on the Kind Community Show. We share stories of founders, activists, and influencers promoting positivity and protection of our planet, discussing how collaboration can help make the sustainable attainable. On today's episode, we have one of my dearest and closest friends, Alita Fabiano. She's the communications specialist and advocate for inclusive change-making based in Ottawa, Canada. Alita lost her hearing at 19 years of age. She's since made it her mission to encourage, promote, and represent inclusive growth so that those belonging to underrepresented communities are given the opportunity to fully participate in society. Throughout her career in communications and policy, she has seen how true inclusion can foster the creative thinking necessary in finding solutions to more inclusive communities and the climate crisis. In today's episode, we will learn about some of the biggest issues faced when it comes to disability justice, ableism, and what an inclusive future could really look like when we consider everyone in the face of the climate crisis. I'm so excited to have you here, Alita. Thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
Hi, Izzy. Thanks for having me.
It feels like life comes, around in full circle. We've known each other for so long. I'm so happy you were able to come on our show.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. Sorry, and collaborate with you guys. Definitely full circle.
No, it's really important that we have these types of conversations. So I'm really excited to get into it. Can you tell us a bit more about your background, Alita, for people who may not know you, and then about your introduction to sustainability policy and culture?
Yes, definitely. So a little bit more about me. When I was 19, I was diagnosed with having a tumor. As part of that, it left part of my face paralyzed, as well as I lost my hearing on one side, leaving me half deaf. So from that time on, I was constantly finding creative solutions to kind of be included in conversations, whether it was in my education or my career, and kind of having to adjust and face different barriers. So then, but then I think when that kind of interconnected with sustainability and the climate crisis movement is early on in my career, I was doing policy related communications and marketing for a business association that lobbies to the government. And one of the sectors we worked on was climate change. And we released a report on policies that the government could adopt to make it easier for larger corporations to adopt green practices and make sustainable choices within their businesses. And we released that report publicly. And the backlash we received from the Canadian public was surprising. A lot of people, we got some feedback that were just upset that we even said climate change was real. And that really opened my eyes that in Canada, we kind of live in this bubble where you recycle and that's kind of enough. That's doing your part. And it's not really talked about enough. And there's so much more to it than just putting things in a green bin. And so after that, I kind of looked into the importance of kind of inclusivity of climate solutions, and mainly the communications surrounding it due to that Canadian bubble. And, I've, upon deeper research, I've seen even events and even communities that have been inaccessible to kind of partaking in that movement or receiving, more information on it. And so, so it really opened my eyes into how we don't necessarily know that's all going on. And unless you experience being left out of conversations or not being able to partake because of your disability, you don't really realize it's going on. And so, so that was kind of my introduction to it and kind of really made me start thinking of ways I can get involved and kind of how I can do my part. And so I know that one person cannot represent all people with disabilities since we're all unique and have different experiences. But I'm hoping through this conversation we're going to have today that based on my personal and professional experiences of being half deaf, that I can shed light to kind of how people with disabilities can make meaningful contributions to the climate crisis movement.
No, absolutely. I think, I mentioned this to you before. I think it's like the lack of integration creates that lack of consideration. So having these conversations is so important. Thanks for sharing that. And as you mentioned, language and conversation is so important. when having these types of discussions. And the term diversibility is one that runs at the heart of the blog post that you kindly written to be featured on the Kind Community blog, Clarity. And for those of you who are watching who may not have read it, please do give it a read on our website. Can you elaborate on what this movement means? And then more to you personally, what is diversibility?
Yeah, so diversibility refers to a diversity in ability levels, whether that be physical, cognitive, or communicative. It really just puts the emphasis on celebrating individual differences, whereas sometimes the misconception with the word disability is that someone's not able to do something. It's putting the burden on the person. It's kind of seeing them as lacking. So diversibility really just celebrates that everyone can contribute in society. We just have different ability levels. And for me, that's important because with people with disability, we're not lacking anything. Often society builds a world that creates those barriers for us. But in reality, we're just as capable as everyone else, and we should be viewed as such. So I think Diversibility is a great movement that kind of celebrates that and shines light on that.
That's great. To be completely honest, I've never heard of the term diversibility. So thank you very much for enlightening me on what that really means and what that movement is. I know a lot of the time when we think about activism, we think of kind of like that one size fits all approach. You know, we think about the marches and the protests, but that tends to exclude a lot of people. And also perhaps it makes certain people feel like they're not doing enough. Have you ever felt left out of that one size fits all type of approach when it comes to social justice and climate activism?
Yeah, so I definitely have to an extent. You know, I'm lucky where I don't have any, mobility issues, and people with such would have a lot more barriers into even attending an event or attending a protest. But even I've went to events and discussions and I couldn't hear, people aren't using microphones, or there's a lot of background noise and I can't hear the conversations being had. And if I can't hear the conversations, I can't share my viewpoint. I can't, speak on it because I don't know what's even being said. So that's been a barrier I've had to face, kind of where I didn't fit into that one size fits all approach. Also, I'm the biggest, I'll shout it from the rooftops, with video without closed captioning. It's kind of the simplest way to include someone, in my opinion, with a hearing impairment. And so a lot of times I come across videos and they have background music with a voiceover, and there's just too many sounds for me to differentiate. And unfortunately, it could be an extremely informative video for me. But if it doesn't have closed captioning, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Quite frankly, yes.
And sometimes it's the smallest changes that can make the biggest differences. And it just takes that mindset shift and the consideration of everyone to ensure everyone is included. And what do you think are the biggest misconceptions when it comes to disabilities and activism?
And exactly to touch what you said, I think a lot of times, there's no malintent. It's a mindset shift. And a lot of times people don't realize what they're doing isn't accessible to all because they haven't faced those barriers. So it's not something that's top of mind. So I think one of those misconceptions, though, is kind of people with disabilities are seen a little bit as an outlier in activism. So because you don't necessarily personally see us at protests or at events that might be inaccessible and that our voices might not be heard as loud, we're seen as just not being overly active in the movement when that's not the case. There's different ways to participate virtually or through conversations. So I think that that's the misconception, is that we're not participating or as active as other members of this community, when in fact we're just participating differently. And because we're not because there's that disconnect and we're not often included in the conversation because we're not being seen or considered. So it's tough because it doesn't seem like we're ever the ones leading the activism or kind of put in those leadership roles because we're participating differently.
Yeah, when in reality, you're probably the best leaders in this space. And what does climate activism mean or look like to you?
Yeah, it means many things. You know, it's not just one event. It's not just one active. It's not going to a protest. It's not just, you know, trying to limit your use of plastics. It's so much more. It's meaningful conversations. It's policy making. It's ongoing advocacy as an activist, and making sure that there's a diversity and inclusion of different people when that's all happening in every facet.
Yeah. And, you know, one thing that's becoming increasingly clear, and it's just one aspect, but it's the way that cities are being built, and indeed even our so-called kind of modern solutions to climate change are maybe not as inclusive as we may think. Actually, they're not. And they are solutions that are built without taking into account the diverse nature and underrepresented people in our communities. And just to make this clear, as I mentioned, this is really only one example in which people with disabilities aren't being prioritized, because there's a multitude of other examples, you know, when it comes to policy, when it comes to adaptation, when it comes to planning and the climate conversation in general. As I understand it, these are classic examples of ecoableism. But for grounding purposes, can you elaborate on what this term means, and finally how you're shining a light on ecoableism?
Yes, definitely. So ecoableism are activists who, through attempting to save the environment, don't always take into account those with less privilege than them, which leads to discrimination in favor of able-bodied people. An example is how often people with disabilities are kind of villainized for needing to use single-use plastics, when in reality they need them to survive. Some people need, myself included, need straws to drink out of. I'm able to use those eco-friendly kind of paper straws. Not everyone is. But I've been to places in restaurants where I need to use a straw due to my facial paralysis, and they go, oh, we've eliminated them to be more sustainable. And I kind of get looked down upon for even asking, when in reality, I need it to drink out of, or I may, you know, make a little bit of a mess. And so there hasn't necessarily been consideration, or we've kind of been looked down upon for so many to use single-use plastics. And quite frankly, zero waste isn't always an option for people with disabilities. You know, we have plastic medical devices and, you know, prescription refills that come in those little plastic containers. And so it's just not always feasible. And so someone with mobility issues may not even be able to afford someone to, say, come in and do dishes for them. Mm-hmm. And they're not able to do dishes, so they use disposable plates and utensils. So there's just so many things to consider that that people often don't, and we get looked down upon for as a community, when we don't have a choice. And I'm sure we'd love nothing more than to be able to eliminate those, but just based on the barriers we face, we have to keep using them. And that's not to say we're any less of climate activists. It's just we need these to get by in our daily lives, and we try to find alternate solutions when we can, and we participate in a different way. So that's one kind of example of, or many examples of ecoableism in just the day-to-day life. And so I feel like where I come in through is through allyship, and just shining a light on this. When I've seen things mainly virtual in the society we kind of live on, I try to reach out to brands privately and let them know that, let's say, closed captioning should be on their videos and why it should be, or easy to read text on their images. And so ecoableism is like an unconscious bias that I don't think people realize they're doing. And so I don't necessarily expect everyone to just get it right, or every organization to get it right off the bat. But I think by helping them realize they're contributing to it and educating people, I think that'll help them make better choices in the future. And I think that's also kind of touches on why it's important to have people with diverse backgrounds and leadership roles and at organizations, because a lot of time, I'm sure if there's someone with a disability, you know, involved in the organization, they would have flagged that. And so that's why it's so important to have kind of diverse workplaces and organizations. And yeah, so yeah, this is just why diversity of opinions in an organization is so important. Because when people are represented within the sustainability movement, there's less of a chance that those biases will occur. We need to be fighting. We don't want to be fighting one another and making people feel bad for things they may need to do. We need to be working together to kind of fight those industries that are truly harming the environment and kind of making a bigger impact by working together.
Absolutely. I think it's so timely that you mentioned kind of you mentioned the plastic straws, and I think kind of the straw bans are so dangerous when you think about it in this way. And it's quite timely, given that's Plastic Free July. And like you said, I think it's important that if you can do it, great, because that is one part of the sustainability movement is, eliminating plastics where you can, if you can, but ensuring that you're not shaming people for, potentially still having to use plastics because there aren't yet those creative solutions or alternative materials for people who still need that access to it. So I think, that's a really good call out, is if you can do it, great, but be mindful. And even, things like Plastic Free July, how does that make people feel if they can't participate in that month? So I think it's just doing your own part, but also being very conscious and mindful and ensuring that we're all part of the movement and ensuring that alternative and creative solutions are out there for everyone to partake in.
Exactly. Sorry, that's spot on. So it's like everyone do what you can and just recognize everyone's doing their best. You don't know what someone's going through. And so it's great if you can eliminate single-use plastics. Just keep in mind not to look down on people who don't, because you don't always know what they're going through. Not every disability is a visible disability. And so it's just, camaraderie and working together and not excluding people, quite frankly. And so just that mind shift change of just being open-minded and consider that other people might have a different background than you.
Yeah, absolutely. The UN Environment Program highlighted access to resources, vulnerability to environmental changes in climate, and difficulty with enforced migrations as areas disproportionately affecting those with impairments. Could you enlighten us as to the intricacies of living through a climate crisis with a disability and how that experience has been like for you specifically?
Yeah, definitely. Being a person with a disability through a climate crisis is really serious. Quite frankly, people with disabilities often can't evacuate swiftly and often must leave behind their medical devices or their medical equipment in the process of evacuating. In terms of change in climate weather patterns, those often mostly negatively affect people with disabilities. Longer winters means a lot of people with mobility disabilities are kind of stuck inside their home and can't access the resources they need outside of the home due to the weather. Hotter summers typically have flare-ups for chronic illnesses. And so the climate crisis definitely impacts people with disabilities in a very serious way. An example, I had read an article where during the fires in California, there was a Black queer environmental justice activist with asthma who went into respiratory distress and now lives with a permanent brain injury because of that, the smoke and all that and dealing with the fires. And so the wildfires are a tragedy and speak to, that climate crisis and what's happening in our world. But, people with disabilities are disproportionately affected compared to the rest of the population when these things occur. For myself personally, I don't know if the Canadian government will send emergency alerts on cell phones where they vibrate and ring to alert people of an emergency. And I often don't hear those emergency alerts on my phone. I also don't hear, a lot of times if I'm sleeping, I won't hear a smoke detector go off or wake up. So in a situation like that, there's a possibility I wouldn't even know to evacuate, or if it was during the night to even get up and leave. So there's the larger issue of how governments communicate about climate crisis and whether or not it's in a timely and accessible format for people with disabilities. And I know in an emergency, it's, get it out and disseminate as quickly as possible. But in the trying to get it out quickly doesn't always make it accessible. And by the time there's an accessible communication that's went out, a lot of times it can be too late. And so that is kind of sometimes a fear of mine personally, is just not being aware of what's going on due to my having a communicative disability.
That's really interesting. Because again, even like the fire example, like a fire alarm. Yeah. Who do you think is kind of like whose responsibility do you think it should be to create those solutions, in the sense of, do you think it's the corporations and businesses who are creating those systems, or like, for example, a fire alarm, if we just stuck to that, or do you think it's government and policy? Who do you think has the most, I guess, responsibility in that change?
I definitely do think it's government and policy. Businesses are kind of at the heart of our communities, and I do see them, putting in the work where they can for the most part. And also a lot of times there is technology out there that could assist. For example, I could get a machine that would vibrate my bed if the fire alarm went off, but those are extremely costly. And so the policy that oftentimes people with disabilities face is that there isn't enough program funding, or there isn't the policy in place or the procedures in place that the government is enforcing to make sure people follow it. And so I do think government kind of needs to lead the way on this change. And if they led the way, then businesses and people would follow suit. And so there's a lot of factors that go into it. It's policy, it's funding. It's, not everyone has the financial means to get the tools they need to get through those barriers. And most people don't, quite frankly. So, I definitely think it's something that needs to be addressed by government. In terms of communicating emergencies, when it's an emergency, you just want to get something out to the masses as quickly as possible. So I don't fault them for that at all. Maybe it's time to be more innovative in finding alternate ways to communicate, or additional ways, and a new procedure that when an emergency happens, sure, you alert them on their phone, it's on the news, but maybe there's a new solution that needs to be created that hasn't been yet on how you can approach people with disabilities into receiving those messages. And I think part of that innovation is having people with disabilities included in that change making and in that process. Have them come up with the solutions that work for them. Because oftentimes able-bodied people don't realize the solutions don't work for everyone because they don't experience it. So I think just being part of the process is the biggest thing.
Of course. And it's a great segue into my next question around kind of creative solutions. But in an article by Elizabeth Wright, who's a disability activist, noted that able-bodied people lack the imagination to think inclusively. And by this merit, those of us who are able-bodied must be making the effort to scrutinize our practices in sustainable development. You've mentioned before about finding creative solutions perhaps not immediately visible to those of us who do not experience ableism on a daily basis. Can you talk us through what these creative solutions look like? I know you kind of gave a few examples, but do you have any recommendations for actually fostering this type of thinking in, say, the workplace or among friends?
Yeah, definitely. So to go back to the earlier point I made, I wouldn't necessarily say able-bodied people lack the imagination, but rather people with disabilities have faced obstacles their whole life they've had to overcome on their own. And that resilience and determination are traits that foster creative problem solving. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I think it's so great. So creative solutions can look like building green infrastructure that is truly attainable for all in terms of cost and mobility accessibility. I think we'd mentioned earlier on a lot of green housing infrastructure. It's great, but if there's things like community rooftop gardens, well, a rooftop garden isn't accessible to people with mobility issues. And sometimes it's just the cost to take the more sustainable housing option as well. So I think creative solutions look like addressing those barriers that are kind of being overlooked right now with these kind of new builds and new movements. So two things, just to recap, two things that are often overlooked by environmental activities that really affect whether or not some one can choose the sustainable option is cost and accessibility. So I think the biggest way to foster this type of thinking is to always surround yourself with as much diversity as possible. The more people at the table with different backgrounds, whether it's a personal or professional discussion, the better. Everyone has different experiences and worldviews, which is why it's important to have underrepresented segments of the population represented to share their opinion and help fight unconscious bias that organizations might not realize that they have. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's so important that in every organization, and particularly government, you need to see people that represent you. And I don't think that's the case in many countries, unfortunately. But pushing for that change, and as you said, it's ensuring that you're surrounding yourself with as many people with different experiences, different backgrounds, different abilities that you can learn from, and just I think that's the only way we're going to kind of spur that creative thinking and come to be able to tackle the climate crisis with the right solutions for all, is having these types of conversations. I could have I could just echo everything you're saying.
Yeah, no, I agree. And how you said, a lot of times politicians don't really represent us or, even, the sustainability community. And that's it. It's a fact that there are very few disabled politicians, right? Just statistically, there are less of them than how many people with disabilities there are in the world. It's kind of disproportionate. If you look at the numbers. And so I think politicians and government do have a responsibility to be encouraging our youth to get more active in politics, finding, people with disabilities and encouraging them to get involved. Same thing with the climate crisis, like finding activists and to get involved in politics. Because right now we kind of have this one view of politicians, and I don't think it represents our generation today. It's not very as inclusive as look at this conversation we're having, we're talking about climate and people with disabilities, and it's two women having the conversation. And I don't think politics is as diverse as, the businesses, and a lot of times businesses or organizations are now leading the way. And so I think that needs to be reflected, and government has a responsibility to be encouraging us to get more involved.
Yeah, and making sure it happens. I think there's a difference between encouragement and the facade of saying, no, get involved, and then nothing happening. Because you see that a lot, I think, in organizations where they say, oh, we want to be diverse. And then you look at the C-suite and you say, well, what are you actually doing to make it happen?
Yeah, they definitely need to walk the talk or talk the walk. It needs to follow for sure.
Exactly. And what would you like to see for the future of disability justice? And even for people who are, tuning in now, who want to do more and get involved in disability justice, figure out ways to educate themselves, or, to volunteer, to donate. I mean, there's so much that we can do to support and become allies in this space. Whatever that may be, what would you like to be done in this space?
Yeah, definitely. So I think the biggest barriers are not being able to contribute meaningfully, and that's kind of been echoed throughout this conversation we've had. We need to be leaders in the solution, or else it will not be an attainable solution for all. Right now, we're working on a solution, but only a few can access that solution. So unless we're included, the solution won't be long lasting. And, on that note, I am thankful there's organizations like Kind Community that are bringing people from different backgrounds like myself on a platform, so we can see how intersectionality needs to be at play with the environmental activism. So these are important conversations to have. And that said, in a couple of years, I've seen willingness to want to hear the perspectives of underrepresented communities, which has definitely made me hopeful. While not everyone is aware of our struggles, people now want to understand them and no longer want to be ignorantly ableist in their efforts. There is wanting to do better, a genuine wanting, and that's really great to see. So just seeing people care makes me hopeful for an even greater systemic change to come. What people can do, though, if they want to get more involved and be an advocate for people with disabilities, they can educate themselves on the barriers faced by people with disabilities. So it's not always kind of on us to educate. Listen to those voices when they speak up and make sure you're keeping them in your mind in your communications or events to ensure they're accessible to everyone. Just like an example is I understand that not every event can be accessible. Not a protest might not be accessible to anyone, but you still want to have one. But when you're kind of doing the invitation or talking about the event, it's always important to state, what the accessibility is. Like think about what information would someone with a disability need to know in order to know if they can or cannot participate. So, so being like, okay, this protest is taking space on even terrain. So someone knows, okay, if it's not uneven, if it's not gravel, or if it's flat, that, someone with like an assistant mobility device could, walk on it. And so just things like that, sharing information, oversharing information maybe, and just keeping in mind, putting yourself in other people's shoes, as simple as it sounds, when making those decisions.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Alita, for sharing that. I think we all need to make that conscious effort. I think events, this is just one example, but I mean, there's so many. I think if we really put some thought into it, we could really make more of an effort. Everyone could. And thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. Now for a quick fire round.
Okay.
A couple of questions, snappy answers. First one, how do you define sustainability?
Okay, sustainability, I kind of identify as reducing your use or consumption of natural resources. I say reduce over eliminating to be inclusive. I chose the word reduce consciously because not everyone can eliminate the use. So reducing your use and your consumptions as best as you can in order to help our earth. And as we discussed today, not everything is accessible or attainable for all groups in society. So doing your personal best is enough.
Reduce. Great. What are you most hopeful for?
The next generations of leaders, I think. I'm seeing people our age, people younger than us, get so involved and passionate about, social justice movements and climate and so many things. Like I haven't seen previous generations get this involved. And so I'm so hopeful for the next generation of politicians and the next generation of business leaders, and to see all that they'll accomplish.
Yeah, so am I. What are you most fearful of?
That's a good one. I think for myself, not having my voice heard or not making a difference in my lifetime. I think for the environment, that too much damage has already been done. That said, doesn't mean we're going to stop trying. So, yeah.
Yeah, we all have great things to input and everyone should be heard. So thanks for that. And who inspires you?
I don't think it's any one person. I think just anyone who's had to ever overcome adversity in their life, I find truly inspiring, because there's something to be said for someone that can kind of conquer obstacles in life and come out stronger, whether it's just something personal or something on a larger magnitude.
And Alita, where are you going to be in 10 years?
Oh boy, you put me on the spot. Hopefully we'll still be friends.
Of course.
Hopefully we'll still be friends. Hopefully I'll be kind of an even stronger advocate and advocates for both, again, the climate crisis and people with disabilities. Hopefully I will positively impact even one person's life to make a positive change, and that would make me happy. And hopefully I'll have more dogs.
Yes, you do love your dogs. Oh, yeah. That's amazing. Well, thank you so much, Alita, for speaking with us today. It was so great learning about you and your connection with disability justice. Can you please let our audience know where to find you and become involved in more inclusive activism?
Definitely. So you can find me at Alita Fabs on Instagram or Twitter. Yes. I don't know if I'm putting the right. Sorry if I'm not. Some great representatives in the sustainable base, as well as in the diversity and disability space. There's the Disability Visibility Project, which is a great resource that offers in-depth kind of interviews and podcasts from people with disabilities. And often they discuss how it interconnects with other social movements like the climate crisis. For a UK-based one, there's Ouch, the Cabin Fever podcast, which covers disability in relation to other issues. I'm also a fan of the Disability Equity podcast. Daphne Frias on Instagram, she's great. She's a 22-year-old Latina with a disability who is passionate about fighting climate crisis. And lastly, Sustainability is an amazing organization with a network of disability climate activists who discuss an inclusive vision for the future. So those are all great podcasts and resources to check out.
That's fantastic. We're going to have to put those up on our website or on our socials as well. So thank you so much for sharing. And Alita, I'll speak to you soon, but thank you so much for coming on to our show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Bye, Alitas. If you enjoyed my conversation with Alita today, please do share, like, and subscribe for more conversations like these. It's so important that these types of conversations are heard and continue as well. So we go live every Friday and very much look forward to having you join us next week. Have a wonderful weekend.